all that remains of my top 31 Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes is the top 10. These are my all-time favorites. Once again, major spoiler warning, since it's very hard to talk about these episodes without discussing the endings. Now, without further ado, let's jump right in. Number 10. The Ghastly Grinner. This episode is a loving tribute to superhero comics, or more accurately, to supervillains. Ethan dreams of being a comic artist, and for a kid who's no older than 15, his artwork is pretty darn good. However, he's got nothing but rejection letters thus far. He is invited to a newly opened comic book shop, where the enthusiastic, punkish owner, Frankie, says she sees a lot of great potential in him. She gives Ethan a rare, one-of-a-kind copy of a comic about an evil jester called the Ghastly Grinner. We don't get to see too much of the interior, but the story seems to revolve around this maniacal villain who is able to turn everyone around him into laughing idiots, very much like a certain clown prince of crime. Ethan makes the mistake of reading the comic in class, and his teacher casually retaliates by dropping it in a fish tank. Later, Ethan tries to dry the comic by sticking it in the microwave. This causes the Grinner to somehow escape the comic into the real world, where he quickly begins to infect everyone around him with his evil powers. Ethan and his adorably awkward friend Harper head back to the comic shop, where Frankie reveals that the Grinner wasn't so much created as he was discovered. Frankie's father, the comic artist Sylvester Uncas, apparently was able to see into other worlds using his comics, but the Grinner was able to see right back into ours. Before Uncas could write a second issue to stop the clown, it somehow captured him. Now only Ethan has the ability to contain, and hopefully destroy, the Grinner. As I mentioned, the Grinner draws heavy inspiration from the Joker, another evil clown who puts eternal smiles on the faces of his victims. The full extent of his powers is never really made clear, but he's most definitely a threat. This episode does a great job teasing the audience, giving us a decent idea of what the Grinner looks like from the comic art, but holding off on showing us him in his full live-action glory. Instead, we follow his trail of destruction, seeing his blue-drooling, cackling victims. He seems to be able to come and go as he pleases too, having a lot of fun just being the ultimate comic baddie, without a hero to put a stop to his badness. This is a very stylized episode, one that has a lot of fun with the subject matter and not taking itself too seriously, yet is somehow able to be scary at the same time. For every bizarre screen transition that seems to take inspiration from the Adam West Batman series, there's a frightening scene where the Grinner attacks his victims. It's a pretty well-balanced episode, and a nice tribute to superhero comics. The sight of the Ghastly Grinner and the effect he has on the people who hear his terrible laughter has managed to stay with a lot of viewers over the years. Speaking of clowns, I love that the Crimson Clown makes a cameo in the comic shop as a cardboard cutout. I wonder what his comic is about. Continuing to highlight voice actors from our childhoods, Ethan is played by Amos Crawley, who has done a lot of voice work over the years, including Arnold from the Magic School Bus and Owl from Little Bear. Number 9. The 13th Floor. Before Slender Man became a viral sensation, we 90s kids had a different faceless being to fear. Karen and Billy are siblings. Billy is very athletic, and Karen is very clumsy. She's adopted and often wonders if her biological parents were anything like her. They like to play in their apartment building's top floor, floor 13, which has been abandoned for years. They hear that they're getting new tenants up there soon, a toy company. That's exciting news, especially for kids. Karen is even invited to their grand opening. Although Billy is not, Karen insists on bringing him since, hey, he's her brother. The toy company has set itself up in the matter of one day, and it's a nice mix of whimsical and off-putting. The toys seen are super generic, and the colors are muted pastels. It almost comes off as a parody of a toy store, and we will, of course, soon see why. The kids are instructed to test out a Simon Says-style memory game. Karen soon finds she's doing much better than Billy, who as quickly began to get tired. The next game Karen plays involves using telekinetic powers. She is naturally amazed at this, but her wonder turns to fear when she sees Billy has passed out, and one of the toy workers has taken off his realistic mask to show he has a blank face underneath. Then Karen finds herself lifted upwards, where more faceless people reach out to her. This episode has some very striking imagery. Although I didn't know the phrase Uncanny Valley when I first watched this one, I think this might have been one of my first exposures to that concept. Everything involving the toy factory and its mysterious owners feels very off and wrong, but in a subtle sort of way. As I said, the design of the factory is amazing in how it's just off-kilter enough. The behavior of the people running it is also well acted. They try their best to come off as normal humans, but they're clearly struggling. The episode is very well paced, too. The exposition is gotten out of the way pretty quickly, but in a mostly natural manner, and things begin to happen quickly enough that the viewer's interest is almost immediately piqued. This episode does not take its time, it just goes for it, and it does a wonderful job. I remember being creeped out at some of the early scenes, where one of the aliens appears to Karen on a TV screen in her bedroom. They unnerved me so much that I didn't want to sleep in a room with a TV in it as a kid. But this is more than a story about two kids running from aliens. The aliens are here for an important reason, and a tragic one at that. The ending reveals that Karen is actually one of them, who was accidentally left behind years ago when she was an infant. The atmosphere needed to be at the right level for her to fully regain her memories, but by changing it, they were slowly killing Billy. Ultimately, in her confused state, Karen chooses to rescue her brother, and the aliens sadly send her a message saying they will return for her in 10 years. Although the story ends on a spooky note with Billy seeing Karen as a faceless alien and running from the room in fright, it's actually quite sad when you think about it. I like the decision to not show Karen's face. Not only because seeing one more shot of the faceless aliens is scary, but also because we can only wonder what's going on through her head right now. Time to make a note on one of the actors. Aaron Ashmore, who played Billy, went on to rack up quite a bit of credits, notably playing Jimmy Olsen in Smallville. Number 8. The Midnight Madness. Dr. Vink makes his second appearance on this list. In this episode, his profession of choice is a movie director, one whose career goes back to the days of silent films. He's eyeing an old, rundown movie theater. It's one that has a lot of history, but is unloved and neglected today, if by today you mean the early 90s. He offers the theater's sleazy manager a deal. If they show one of his old movies, it will be a success. And then when more people come, they must show all his other movies. The manager ignores the offer, but Vink leaves behind the film reel, which magically causes some old western they're showing to fizzle out. With no other choice, Vink's vampire movie is played, and the audiences adore it. Vink comes out to drop off his other movies, but the manager refuses to show them now that business is booming. Of course, crossing Vink is never a good idea, and as vengeance, Vink releases the vampire from the silver screen to feed. The vampire is, of course, the legendary Nosferatu. He comes from an actual silent film from 1922, which was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It actually got the director in a lot of legal trouble, and led to the movie almost being wiped from existence, but that's another story. In the movie, he's named Count Orlok, but in general, most people seem to just refer to him as Nosferatu. Although the director is credited as F.W. Murnau, Are You Afraid of the Dark informs us that the real director was none other than Dr. Vink. Funny, he doesn't look like John Malkovich. I love how this episode shows such care for silent horror films. In general, I think silent films are kind of creepy. The exaggerated movements of the actors, the powdery, cakey makeup, everything seems very unnatural, and even non-horror films end up looking kind of spooky to me. That's not to show any disrespect to the old silent stars or directors, since without them, we wouldn't have movies, period. But generally speaking, I find horror films to be the most effective of all the silent movies made, and I'm glad this episode's audience seems to agree with me. Once again, the characters are strong in this one. The show's co-creator and producer, DJ McHale, stressed to the writers that scares were important, but good characters will ultimately make or break an episode. It definitely shows in episodes like this with very distinct players. Although the manager deserves to be victimized by the vampire, his two theater workers, Pete and Katie, are completely innocent in the matter. Pete even has been going out of his way to save the theater. They make for a good pair of protagonists, especially Pete, who has a genuine love for the building's history. And of course, this episode is downright scary. Any scene with the vampire is a frightening one, whether he's biting the movie's would-be hero, or emerging into the audience and stalking the kids later on. He was plenty scary in his original silent film too, but I feel that a lot of people nowadays, especially Nickelodeon viewers, remember him more as the culprit who was flickering the lights in the Krusty Krab. For everyone out there, I recommend you watch The Midnight Madness and then the original Nosferatu movie. Count Orlok is one of the first great movie monsters, and it's wonderful to see an episode do him such justice. This is a love letter to the silent horror genre, and a classic story in its own right. Christopher Heyerdahl, who played Nosferatu, was also Leonid, one of the faceless aliens in the previously discussed 13th Floor. This wasn't the only time he played a vampire either. He was Marcus in the Twilight movies. Number 7. The Night Shift. 2 vampire episodes in a row. That's just how I ended up ranking the episodes. This was the final episode produced of the show's original run before it was renewed a few years later. They knew this would be their big finale, so they pulled out all the stops here. Sadly, this episode ended up not being the final one to air. That honor went to the Tale of Badge. Although Badge did make my list, and I talked about him in part 2 of this countdown, he simply does not compare with the story, which was another episode that scared me so badly as a kid that I didn't watch it whenever it came on. This one has a killer premise. What would happen if a vampire invaded a hospital, full of people who are unable to leave? As if hospitals aren't stressful enough already. This is one smart vampire too. In a page taken from Dracula's playbook, he ships himself there, in a package marked as a water pump, and gets right to work chowing down. His first victim is the janitor, Felix. The vampire transforms into a beautiful blonde and lures him to his doom. Now that's a page from Freddy Krueger's playbook. Or maybe the tall man from Phantasm. As the vampire works his way through the staff and patients, we follow our main characters, Amanda and Colin, around. Amanda is a hard-working nurse, and Colin is a patient and also kind of a douche. He's one of those characters who's meant to be roguish and charming, but ends up looking like an ass most of the time. Still, they seem to be the only ones who can avoid the vampire long enough to be able to form a plan to stop him. However, throwing a monkey wrench into things is the vampirized Felix, who is caught between wanting to help his friends and giving into his primal blood-sucking urges. The vampire in this episode is not only scary, he's intelligent. He can convincingly disguise himself as a human, and he's such a pro that we can only assume he's been doing this for a very long time. Using a hospital as an easy buffet is a stroke of genius, assuming he's unaffected by chowing down on an ill patient or something. In one extremely horrifying moment, he considers dropping Amanda off the roof of the hospital and lapping up whatever's left over. The chase leading to the rooftop is pretty chilling as well. He chases Amanda while disguised as a perky girl, Margot, who never drops her cheerful demeanor as she hunts down her victim. She's very confident in herself, and her upbeat yet somewhat blasé attitude during her stalking is wonderful to behold. In fact, all the actors are great in this one. In addition to Margot, I have to single out Felix as a well-done character. While his fight against fully turning into a monster isn't exactly anything new, it's still handled very well. I can't help but feel he ends up with the short end of the stick when the story's over. He has to go back to working for a boss who constantly belittles him, with no one aside from Amanda and Colin knowing of his heroics. We salute you, Felix. A true hero in a great episode. For trivia, this is the first on-screen credit of Alicia Cuthbert. She would appear as a member of the New Midnight Society a couple years later, before going on to star in shows like 24 and Happy Endings. Number 6. The Renegade Virus. Shifting gears, we're moving from one of the most genuinely scary episodes of the series to one of the wackiest. Simon and Evan are best friends, but are also engaged in a vicious prank war. When their eccentric genius of a computer teacher, Mr. Poe, perfects a virtual reality machine, Evan plants a computer virus in it, knowing Poe will let Simon test it out first. The virus is much stronger than Evan anticipated, however, and rather than just messing with Simon's mind a little, the virus wants to invade it, and use Simon as a vessel to enter our world. This sounds pretty creepy, but the presentation of the story is completely bonkers in the best possible way. The glitched-out virtual world Simon finds himself in is a bizarre parody of his hometown. It's bizarro enough to be creepy, but kooky enough to be a lot of fun as well. The undisputed highlight, though, is the Renegade Virus himself, a little person dressed like a Cenobite from Hellraiser, with silver skin and an exposed brain. Most of the time, the virus madly giggles to himself and sarcastically calls Simon Einstein, so you know he's got Sonic the Hedgehog levels of 90s attitude. He chews the scenery like nobody's business, and I love him. I love these kinds of episodes, as you can probably tell from my list. What I feel differentiates this one from an episode like The Gruesome Gourmets is that in spite of the silliness, there's a very real sense of peril, and there are even a few legitimate scares. The virus's method of inserting himself into Simon's brain, for example, is through an electrical port in Simon's hand. It's not quite Cronenberg-level disgusting, but it's certainly enough to make most people wince. This episode really does find the perfect balance between surreal wackiness and actual horror. I also like the treatment of the main characters. Well, most of the time we're following Simon, who is actively victimized by the virus. The opening sequence shows him relentlessly pranking Evan again and again. Although their prank war has been going on for a while, and the implication is that Evan's gotten plenty over on Simon before, our heart goes out for the poor guy. At the same time, even though Evan had no idea how bad the virus would get, the very idea of putting a virus in a virtual reality console to screw with your friend is obviously questionable. I guess I admire that although neither of our two main kids are particularly good people, we still find ourselves sympathizing with and rooting for them. Once again, the show boasts some pretty well-written characters. But as much praise as I give the handling of the two boys, the biggest draw is, of course, the virus. He's one of the best villains that's ever been on the show, not to mention one of the most unforgettable. Number 5. The Super Specs. It has taken us so long to get to one of my favorite characters, Sardo, the sleazy, flamboyant owner of a novelty shop, Magic Mansion. The problem with him is that although he steals the show every time he appears, most of his episodes were just not ones I liked enough to put on the list. Very few of them were ones I'd call bad, but they just didn't compare to my other choices. However, this episode, his first appearance no less, is amazing. Like Dr. Vink's name being misheard as Fink by everyone, Sardo had his own running gag. Whenever the kids would address him as Mr. Sardo, he would angrily respond, and say it with me now, "It's Sardo! No, mister, accent on the do!" He would also always have a nice deal on fake vomit, although no one ever took him up on that for some reason. If they had, perhaps they could have avoided the problems that his magical items always ended up causing. For example, in this episode, Mary Beth is visiting the shop with her boyfriend, Weeds. I will assume that's a nickname, so make your 420 jokes now and we'll move on. Weeds is messing around with a pair of X-ray specs, the Super Specs, and a bag of supposedly magic dust. Okay, you can allow yourself one more drug joke. At one point, he recites a spell and throws the dust, getting some on the specs. Mary Beth puts on the specs and sees a veiled figure standing in the shop, which does not appear to be there when she takes them off. The more Mary Beth uses the glasses, the more she sees these figures. When she throws the glasses away, they somehow end up in her bag again, and the urge to wear them is strong. However, the terror she feels whenever she does put them on to see these dark figures closing in on her is even stronger. She ends up turning to Sardo to solve the mystery of the Super Specs, but the poor girl's not going to like what she finds. This is another very tightly paced episode. There's never a dull moment, and the creepy scenes with the ninja-like figures Mary Beth keeps seeing are balanced out with some oddball comedy bits of Weeds messing around with his magic dust. This episode is a bit reminiscent of the last episode I covered, the Renegade Virus, because the whole atmosphere is very off-kilter and somewhat cartoony at times. However, while the virus leaned a bit more toward comedy, this episode, in spite of the Weeds trying magic vignettes, ends up leaning more toward horror. Sardo finds out that the Super Specs allow Mary Beth to see into a parallel dimension, and its inhabitants are the dark figures who keep appearing. However, now that the window to the other dimension is opened, both dimensions cannot coexist, and they're basically fighting over the same plane in space. Sardo offers to do a seance or ritual or something to close the window, but the alternate reality people are doing the same thing, and their Sardo-type person is a lot better at her job. It's not entirely clear what she does to Mary Beth, Weeds, and Sardo, but based on their screaming faces trapped in her crystal ball, I imagine it's a Phantom Zone type situation or something. What I'm saying is, it's nothing pretty. I really like how this is one of those episodes where it seems like the villains have won, but when you think about it, the dark figures were just normal people in their own universe, and Mary Beth might have appeared to them as a sinister ninja person. While our sympathies, of course, lie with Mary Beth, Weeds, and yes, even Sardo, it's only because we've been following their side of the story. This is ultimately a tale with no real good guy or bad guy, just a tough situation and a trio of unfortunate victims. It's brilliant writing, and you know if the plot had been done in the Twilight Zone, it would have been hailed as one of the greats. I say we give the Super Specs its due. Thank you for taking your audience seriously, regardless of the age demographic. Also, there's a part where the Otherworld people are playing basketball, and the basketball is painted black to match their ninja outfits, and it's really funny. Number 4. Station 109.1. This is another episode that I definitely related to personally. I don't know if everyone goes through this, but I feel that a lot of people know where I'm coming from. We all know about death. It's the one thing that is completely unavoidable for everyone. And this can be a very scary concept, since although it's something that will happen to you and everyone around you, no one can ever say for sure what it's going to feel like or what's going to happen afterward. I think that when I was about 16, I spent a year or two in a major funk, completely obsessing over the mysteries of death, and I know I'm not alone in that. Ultimately, I was able to work through my anxieties, and I hope everyone else can too. Our protagonist in this story is basically going through a similar thing. Chris is a kid whose death fascination is over the top, to the point of him lying around pretending he's a corpse at his own wake. His brother, Jamie, played by Ryan Gosling, has had enough of this creepy emo nonsense, and locks his brother in a hearse to try to snap him out of it. While an annoyed Chris is messing around with the hearse's radio, he comes across a strange station that seems to be directed at lost souls who need help crossing over into the next world. Now even more curious, Chris goes to the station's address where he meets DJ Roy, played by a name even bigger than Ryan Gosling. Who's bigger than Ryan Gosling, you ask? Only Mr. Gilbert Gottfried, who gives a wonderfully hammy performance, as you'd hope. Roy has mistaken Chris for the dead man who was previously in the hearse, and slaps a bracelet on the kid, which makes him essentially a living ghost. Now Chris has to wait for his turn to be called into the afterlife, represented by an ominous pair of doors that either lead to heaven or hell, depending on the life you've led. Suddenly, Chris isn't that interested in death anymore. Isn't that just the way? Obviously, the biggest highlight here is the presence of Gilbert Gottfried, who is given some genuinely funny material to work with. But beyond the idea of this loud, angry comedian working in a bureaucratic limbo, there's a lot of heart to this story as well. Chris's death obsession, and where it subsequently leads him, is a good moral. Just do your best in life, and death, hopefully, won't be anything to worry about in the ultimate grand scheme. This episode definitely operates on some existential dread, since once Chris is wearing that bracelet, he is unable to be seen or heard by anyone living. After trying to escape the radio station a few times, he finds that all doors lead back to the waiting room. All he can do now is wait to be summoned to the great beyond by Roy's hooded monk-like guards. The lost soul patients, who simply wander around or sit with a vacant look on their faces, are also creepy. As I am reaching the final few entries in this list, I'm realizing that a lot of my favorite episodes aren't necessarily the scariest ones, but the ones that come off more like dark comedies, something akin to Tim Burton's output. With this particular one feeling like it may have taken more than a little inspiration from Beetlejuice. When they achieve that perfect balance between a good amount of fear and a decent amount of laughs, I think that Are You Afraid of the Dark, to me anyway, was really at its best. However, our next entry is just plain creepy. Number 3. The Doll Maker. With a title like that, you might imagine a demented Geppetto-type toy maker building an army of killer puppets or something. That is not, however, what the titular doll maker is. It's something, in my opinion, even more disturbing. Melissa is excited to visit her aunt and uncle in the country, but not necessarily to see her relatives. Rather, she loves spending time with their neighbor, another little girl named Susan. Unfortunately, it turns out that Susan and her family have moved away. A disappointed Melissa thinks she sees Susan in one of the windows, and goes into their house to investigate, where she finds a secret staircase leading into the attic. In the attic sits a perfectly detailed dollhouse version of Susan's house, along with a strange doorway at the end of the room. Melissa's aunt finds her and confesses that Susan went missing a while back, and after all was said and done, her parents moved away, unable to stay in the house any longer. Melissa continues to be drawn to the attic though, even hearing Susan calling to her one night. Her aunt and uncle are understandably worried about the whole ordeal, with the uncle even mentioning that there's something wrong with that house, believing it's somehow responsible for Susan's disappearance. Well, he's right, because Melissa manages to enter that doorway to find that she's been transported into the dollhouse. Susan's been there this whole time too, and has slowly been turning into a doll. That's right. The dollhouse is the doll maker. I know I use the word atmospheric a lot in this retrospective, but it's the best way to describe some of these episodes. The directors really had a knack for dreamlike, creepy visuals. The dollhouse, charming from a distance, is downright gaudy and weird on the inside, very much how most dollhouses would look if someone were to walk around inside them. Susan being trapped as a porcelain doll is a both scary and tragic sight. The one moment that probably spooked the most people is when Melissa asks Susan to help her move things around to find a way out. Susan says she wouldn't be much use, and calmly takes off her porcelain hand to demonstrate this. Ugh, that still gives me shivers. This episode only had 4 characters in total, but all the actors do a great job. Susan's creepy, emotionless performance as a doll girl is especially unsettling. Despite the amazing visuals in the dollhouse scenes, it's ultimately a nice, intimate story about the bond between 2 friends. I think what I love the most about this episode is the lack of context for the dollhouse. We never find out who built it or why it does what it does. In the story's epilogue, we are told that after Melissa and Susan return safely and tell the aunt and uncle what happened, they do something very reasonable for the often skeptic adult characters in these kinds of stories, and just burn the dollhouse. Melissa wonders where the attic door will lead now, if anywhere. That really stirred my imagination as a child, and it still does today. The Doll Maker is perfect Halloween viewing. It will give you the creeps in the best way possible. To mention our final Magic School Bus voice, Melissa's actress, Mia Filer, voiced Phoebe.
At my old school, we never got turned into dolls.
Number 2. The Dark Music. This episode is probably one of the most infamous ones to ever air. It's so well known that just this year I found at least 2 other YouTubers reviewing it. Andy and his family have been on somewhat hard times lately, but things seem to be looking up when his mother inherits a house from a mysterious old uncle she knows almost nothing about. With the new town comes a new bully, a hulking brute named Coda, who is quick to tell Andy that everyone hated his uncle and to stay the hell out of his way. What's worse than a bully who has immediately decided he hates you? A demon living in the basement of your new house. Anytime Andy's in the basement and plays music on a radio, the door to a wine cellar opens, and a mysterious creature tries different ways to lure him inside. First, it appears as a pair of red eyes and politely invites him in. Unsurprisingly, this doesn't work. Next, it appears as a life-size doll, and more or less puts Andy into a hypnotic state, since almost everyone in their right mind seeing that monstrosity would be up the stairs in an instant. Finally, it uses the Pleasure Island tactic, and creates the illusion of a carnival in the room, complete with an old-timey barker. Despite this one coming the closest to working, the demon can't seem to resist scaring Andy at the last second, turning the barker into a giggling skeleton and attempting to physically suck Andy inside. I can only guess the demon operates on Pennywise tactics, and finds his victims tastier when they're traumatized. When life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. When life pits you against a violent bully and a hungry demon, you can do the math on that one. This episode was a first season one, and with that context in mind, you can see that they were trying to experiment with what they could and couldn't get away with. There is some truly twisted stuff here. In addition to that giant doll, a visual that would not be out of place in a horror film aimed at adults, they don't present the story as a morally black and white one. Coda is a jerk, but there's also a very brief scene of his even more unsavory father berating him, giving what would have been an otherwise flat character a somewhat sympathetic angle. They technically didn't even need this scene. The father has about 10 seconds of screen time, but it's enough to elicit some pity toward Coda. Andy, meanwhile, is the usual klutzy protagonist we see in these stories, but his transformation from a victim to a corrupt accomplice to a demon is something that most kids' shows wouldn't try. In the finale, he traps Coda in the basement, and plans to scare him with the literal skeleton in the closet. However, the demon ends up devouring Coda, something Andy was not counting on. As a payment, the demon gives Andy a new bicycle to replace the one Coda destroyed earlier. It says that Andy's uncle used to feed it, and it gave him anything the man wanted in return. Now Andy is offered the same deal. When he hears his bratty sister nagging him upstairs at that moment, his unhinged smile says it all. First the bully, then his sister, and then maybe that sadistic dentist down the street. The potential for new victims is endless. This whole episode has some of the best storytelling in the show, but I think one of my favorite details is the mentioning that Andy's uncle was found dead at the bottom of the staircase. My guess is that he just couldn't get the demon a new victim in time. Andy needs to be careful, or someday he'll be the dead guy in the basement. Whatever they offer you, don't feed the skeleton carnies. Number 1. Laughing in the Dark. And speaking of carnies, our number 1 episode takes place at Funland, a typical amusement park that boasts a funhouse with a sordid history. That's right, it's Zeebo the Clown. I think some of you saw this one coming. Out of all the Are You Afraid of the Dark monsters, Zeebo is probably the most popular one, both with fans and even the show's writers. But more on that soon. In 1924, a clown named Zeebo stole a ton of money from his circus, and was chased to Playland's funhouse, Laughing in the Dark. In addition to larceny, Zeebo had a fondness for cigars, and accidentally ended up burning the funhouse down with him inside. Afterwards, a new Laughing in the Dark was built, complete with a Zeebo figure inside, as a tribute of sorts to the outlaw. Allegedly, the ghost of the clown even haunts the funhouse. One kid, a rather jerky guy named Josh, decides to challenge this old legend. He arrogantly bets his friend Ouija, yes, that's really the character's name, that not only can he make it through the attraction, but he'll steal the nose right off the Zeebo figure and make Ouija wear it to school the next day. Well, Josh does manage to snatch the nose, but all that effort to show he's not scared of an old funhouse is proven futile when the angry ghost of Zeebo comes after him. Everyone knows that at the end of the Got Your Nose game, you give the nose back. Josh brought this on himself. It's a simple story, but a lot of magic comes from how it's told. The second half is mostly Josh being stalked by the ghost of Zeebo, but we never actually see the clown in any of these scenes. Instead, his presence is just hinted at. The shadows of his feet outside Josh's bedroom door, for example, or cigar smoke coming from around the corner of his house. We know Zeebo's closing in on Josh, whether we can properly see him or not. Thankfully, we still get enough glimpses of Zeebo to not feel ripped off. There's, of course, the clown figure inside the funhouse. There's also a cutout of his head outside, a photo of him in a newspaper clipping, and a brief look at his ghost in a hall of mirrors. They did a really good job pulling off how much we get to see Zeebo versus how much is left to our imaginations. I'm a theme park enthusiast, especially old-fashioned dark rides, so I also loved how they portrayed the Laughing in the Dark attraction. It's actually pretty accurate to real rides and walkthroughs from the past. A lot of early funhouses and dark rides weren't themed to anything specific, and were mostly a series of unrelated scenes, sometimes referred to as stunts, meant to startle and amuse guests. Plenty of them had an emphasis more on fun than fear, and had names like Tunnel of Laughs or Wacky Shack. Both the exterior and interior of the Laughing in the Dark funhouse are fairly true to how these attractions were, both aesthetically and in the cheap yet effective gags they offer. Once again, it's an episode that has a happy ending, yet still leaves us feeling somewhat shaken. It's like the funhouse itself. You go in, you get scared, you feel that rush of relief and safety when you step back outside, but it doesn't diminish the fear you felt seconds earlier. It's the most fun in the park when you're laughing in the dark. As I said, Zeebo proved to be popular with the crew behind Are You Afraid of the Dark, and was referenced in half a dozen other episodes. The insult Zeebo or Zeeb was used at least twice, akin to calling someone a bozo. The Crimson Clown and Train Magic episodes even feature a video game called Zeebo's Big House. I hope that someday, an indie programmer can make a real Zeebo's Big House game, because playing a 16-bit platformer starring Zeebo sounds amazing. Outside the series, Zeebo is probably one of the most fondly remembered characters, and even the more casual viewers who haven't obsessively watched the entire series multiple times, i.e. not me, will probably recall an episode involving a clown who came looking for a stolen nose. The wonderful Carney who ushers his guests into the funhouse was played by Aaron Teeger, who was better known in the series as Dr. Vink. In the world of voice acting, if you watched the Donkey Kong Country cartoon, he was also Cranky Kong. And to give a shout out to the final Arthur voice we'll see in this retrospective, Ouija's sister Kathy was played by Tamar Kozlov, who is the voice of Prunilla. Godspeed, Animals of Elwood City. And thus ends my countdown. If you still haven't gotten your fix of 90s Nick nightmares, I highly recommend the podcast You Scared of This, where two fans of the show dissect each and every episode in great detail. One of the highlights is an interview with DJ McHale, where he gives a lot of interesting behind-the-scenes information. I really hope you enjoy this retrospective, especially if you made it all the way through all three parts. I declare this meeting of the Midnight Society... Oh, wait, I used that bit in the last part. Never mind.